Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Tyson Slocum. He is the director of the Public Citizens Energy Program. Tyson, welcome.
Great to be here.
All righty. Donald Trump is about to be inaugurated. He's nominated Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. You wrote an article for CNN.com saying Tillerson is the wrong choice. Why is he wrong?
Well, he's wrong because he is an inherent conflict of interest, because we don't know where Tillerson's advocacy for the U.S. national interest begins and where his advocacy for Exxon's interests ends.
So it's kind of like Dick Cheney. He had that conflict of interest over at Halliburton.
I see this as even bigger, because at least Dick Cheney had some prior record of government service at a variety of different levels. Dick Cheney had served as a member of Congress. He served as a cabinet-level position. Rex Tillerson has none of that. His only thing on his resume for the last 40 years has been an employee of ExxonMobil.
Yeah, it's interesting. The choice of the cabinet in Washington these days, looking out there at the pool of talent, and it's everyone's compromised at this point in the American system, at this point in the cycle, after 30 years of neoliberalism, of pay for play, right. Congress trades on inside information routinely. The swamp is pretty thick and deep. And so there's an argument to be made that why not just bring the biggest swamp creature from the swamp out there and have him, do deals. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the Democratic Party, said, commerce with all nations, alliance with none. So he's a deal maker. Why not have a big deal maker in as Secretary of State?
He's a deal maker, but the problem is that when you're representing an extractive corporation like an Exxon, you've got very unique types of relationships with countries that you don't necessarily see in other types of industries. This puts ExxonMobil and Rex Tillerson...
Why extractive is unique versus, let's say, the business of Monsanto, which is an extraordinarily dangerous, pernicious, horrible business. They started the Ukrainian war. They're pushing into Russia. They're expansionist, corporate, behemoth, monstrous people with Victoria Nuland and her husband,
right.
Lobbying the government, and they think they own the government. I mean, that seems like a lot worse than Rex Tillerson. Rex Tillerson didn't actually start a war like Victoria Nuland did.
Well, actually, he kind of did. In 2011, he cut this deal as the head of Exxon with the quasi-independent Kurdish region in Iraq that happens to be oil-rich. He did this because Baghdad, the central government of Iraq, wasn't giving him terms that he liked. So he just went ahead and unilaterally sidestepped Baghdad and cut this deal with the Kurds. That ran against what U.S. policy was at the time, and it led to actual fighting on the border.
Is the U.S. policy other than to just go get a lot of oil and kill people? I mean, we saw that in Iraq, we've seen it in Afghanistan, we see it all over the world. I mean, the U.S. policy is kill people, grab their oil. So how is that different?
Well, I don't know that was explicitly U.S. policy under the Obama administration.
No, but it's the obvious U.S. policy under all administrations going back decades, in that the U.S. simply is a warmongering, not to use too fine a point, but they like to go to countries, steal their oil, and kill people. I mean, that's pretty much the policy. So why not just have a guy who's maybe they try something different, maybe not pretend like that's not the policy. Maybe say that is a policy, and maybe go to countries like Russia and others and say, you know what, we're all in it for the energy anyway. Maybe we can do it in a better way, more efficient, more productive, more why not?
Well, if we are going to assume that petrodiplomacy should be a hallmark of U.S. foreign policy, it's kind of dated. That's very 20th century. The fact is that the future of the economy, the future of what's going to be powering industry and our households and our transportation sector is not going to be oil. Okay? Now, that's not going to happen overnight, but the CEO of Shell did say last month that he saw global oil demand peaking in the next 15 years. So what we are going to see is a gradual decline in the importance of oil as a diplomatic issue. And so putting someone like Rex Tillerson, just assuming this narrative of, we've always been about oil and foreign policy, so let's just continue that by putting Exxon's CEO as Secretary of State. The problem is that it exposes us to the problem that the future of the global economy is going to be decreasingly
interesting
reliant
point
on
there
oil.
in that, for example, in the solar business, the price of solar energy is crashing, of producing solar energy. It's now competitive with coal. It's cheaper than coal. It's cheaper than these extractive fossil fuel industries, and that does seem to pose an enormous shift in the entire energy matrix for sure. And how do you see that playing out? So let's take your case here. Let's say you've got Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, Exxon guy, and they go to petro foreign policy, but the hydrocarbon industry crashes. You know, solar, we see what happens to solar, what P2P, Napster did to the music industry.
Right.
You know, it's disruptive. So where's the clash there? How does the U.S. deal with that? I think you're right. So what happens?
I'm not sure. It depends upon what kind of leadership we have.
Wait a minute, you're not sure. You're over there at the Public Citizens Energy Program. You're supposed to know this stuff.
Well,
what would Ralph Nader say? He founded that organization, right?
That is correct.
All right. Does he have no plan either? What's going on over there?
No. So the issue here is whether or not the United States is going to continue to pursue a policy of protecting and coddling these monopolistic industries like the fossil fuel industries at the expense of, as you termed it, the disruptive technologies that are disruptive only to those incumbent fossil fuel industries.
They will.
They're liberating to everybody else that can...
Let's assume that they resist the disruption.
Right.
What can be done? Listen, in the technology industry, we've seen this before with, let's say, the free software movement, which took over and totally changed the software industry. As I mentioned, P2P file swapping and this type of thing has changed, and people had to adapt their business models. But it was driven by essentially individual technologists on the ground who are connecting through networks and changing this possibility. Well, is it possible? Let's say this. Let's say a country like Africa, which is going heavy, or not.
Continent.
A continent. How can I make that mistake? Let's say a continent like Africa, which is already going into solar in a big way, they become hugely energy efficient. They start exporting energy. They attach to the grid, and they're now energy exporters. And now they just can they potentially competitively put a lien on the legacy companies?
Possibly. I think the future is going to be in the manufacturing of the components used to produce renewable energy, because the big difference between renewable energy and fossil fuel industry is with fossil fuels, you need continuous fuel supply that is owned or controlled, typically by a corporation, sometimes by national interests, that have to continually fuel that vehicle, that power plant to make the energy you need. With renewable energy, the fuel cost is zero, because your fuel cost is sunlight, it is the wind blowing, and because Elon Musk of Tesla just finished finally the gigafactory out in the Nevada desert, we're going to see within the next 5 years energy storage in a lot of places in the United States be comparable to what utilities are charging us to get access to the grid. So those are the sea change things. So I think those countries, those societies that prioritize manufacturing of all of the necessary components to power a renewable economy, who are securing the patents that are going to be collecting royalties on the production of those facilities.
Well, what country is leading in that regard?
Well, right now, Germany has the most patents and some of the largest manufacturing capacity.
And there are towns in Germany where people have the solar panels on their home. They're actually collecting more energy than they need over the course of the year, and they're selling it back to the grid.
Right,
So
which is insane when you look at where Germany is on the globe, what its latitude is. It's somewhere up near Canada. They have no business being...
But Buckminster Fuller, I think, once pointed out that the amount of energy the Earth receives from the sun every single day is 1,000 times greater than what's used on a daily basis. So
Absolutely.
It's just a matter of efficiencies to grab that energy. What about, so Rex Tillerson is scheduled to be sworn in.
Well, he's got to have confirmation hearings
He's got to be confirmed, right? So you're a Washington guy, okay, so... how is that going to play out? Is it going to be a lot of resistance, or what do you think is going to happen?
Well, that's what we're working on, building that resistance right now. So we're seeing a lot of concern. So he has to first get hearings with the Foreign Relations Committee in the U.S. Senate. You know, the U.S. Constitution says the president can make certain nominations subject to advice and consent by the Senate. The Democrats changed the rules a couple of years ago to actually make it easier to confirm picks. It used to be a 60-vote threshold. Now it's a simple majority. So you're going to have all the Democrats unified, and you're going to have to get some Republicans. So here are the potential issues that might sink a Tillerson confirmation. One would be continued perception that he has an inherent conflict of interest. So Exxon tried to alleviate that on January 4th when they reached this financial agreement with Tillerson. He was due to receive 2 million restricted shares in ExxonMobil, which at today present value is worth about $180 million. So Exxon and Tillerson negotiated this trust agreement where those restricted shares in Exxon stock were going to be immediately converted into cash, put into this independent trust that will pay installments over 10 years to Tillerson. And that cash isn't going to be invested in Exxon, so they're saying, well, we think that it might be separate. The problem is that we've looked over this agreement, and we saw a big glaring loophole. There's a non-compete clause buried in this thing that basically says whenever Tillerson leaves Secretary of State, he cannot go to any other oil and gas company for employment except ExxonMobil, right? So there is this appearance that Tillerson could return to the company in some fashion, probably as a consultant. That's a common pathway for former CEOs. So we still see that there is the potential for continued financial ties between Tillerson and the company. And when you combine that with the fact that all of his overseas experience in dealing with foreign heads of state, dealing with negotiations, have all been done in the capacity of working for Exxon. And so it really does blur the line of where Tillerson's allegiance is really going to lie. This is the only job he's ever had in his 40-plus year career. The other things that might sink him are some of the issues that he engaged in foreign affairs that ran directly counter to U.S. national interests. One was this deal that he negotiated with the independent Kurdish region of Iraq that led to 3 years of instability both within Iraq and with U.S. relations with Iraq because Tillerson's side oil deal ran directly counter to U.S. interests as expressed by the Obama administration. So we've got this situation where he worked on this deal against U.S. national interests. He caught the State Department by surprise.
All right, you know what? This is fascinating. We're going to pick it up in a second segment.
Sure.
Because you're getting into the nitty-gritty.
All right.
You must explore. All right, so stay right there. We'll do another segment. That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser and Stacey Herbert. We were discussing the various conflict of interest that Rex Tillerson would have, making the transition from Exxon to Secretary of State. And we were talking about monopolies in America and the monopolistic interests that are represented by a handful of monopolistic giants in America. And it's tough to get away from that. And when I hear Donald Trump tweet that he's going to look at some of these deals, like the Time Warner, AT&T, I think that's the deal. Shades of Teddy Roosevelt, you know, the trust buster. We don't know exactly what's going to happen yet. It looks bad, but we don't know.
No one really knows.
We don't know.
Detail.
It looks bad, but we don't know. I mean, so what are your thoughts in terms of this? My point being that, yeah, Rex Tillerson looks like a terrible choice, but like the whole system is screwed up. Is there a possibility that there could be like a reform in the style of the Teddy Roosevelt reform we saw?
There's absolutely a possibility. The challenges are that Trump is likely going to delegate a lot of sweeping authorities to his various cabinet level picks. And so it's going to matter a lot who he puts in charge. And the problem is the people that he's put in charge look worse than the status quo. I do think that Trump has some very interesting tendencies that are sort of populist. You know, he was in the Manhattan business scene, but he was never accepted by Wall Street. He never really hobnobbed with the big Fortune 500 CEOs. And so he's a little distrustful. He wasn't in their world. But so far, a lot of his cabinet picks look like the Fortune 500.
He was a bit of an outsider, even in the developing world.
He was.
His dad, Fred, I guess, they started out in the burb, the Queens.
Right. And
they had a lot of development. In New York, Manhattan was always the holy grail, but it was a bit of an insider's club.
Absolutely.
And then during the 70s, when New York City went bankrupt, he kind of stepped in, and they did some hotel deals at that time, I guess, when nobody else wanted to, and he stepped up. And he planted his flag in Manhattan. But he kind of remained that outsider. And I think he's carrying that to the White House now, saying, even though I'm a rich guy, I never go through Goldman Sachs. I'm not Jamie Dimon. I'm still kind of a renegade. So you think there might be taking that into the White House a bit, and he can push back against these guys?
He might.
Yeah.
But the problem is that there's a lot that Donald Trump doesn't know about. And for the things that he doesn't know about, he's going to rely on this circle of campaign contributors and other advisors. So let's take energy policy, for example. His number one advisor during the campaign on energy policy was an oil company CEO by the name of Harold Hamm, who runs Continental Resources, one of the largest companies engaged in oil fracking in the United States. So Trump, during the campaign and even during the transition period, has been talking about the need to produce more oil, to frack more natural gas, to get coal mines back up and running. And he's been poo-pooing the ability of renewable energy to meet our needs.
Okay, let me ask you this question. So you were your organization there, started by Ralph Nader, the Public Citizens Energy Program. He wrote a book, I think it was called "Let the Billionaires Work It Out."
Trump said that,
Ralph Nader.
Ralph Nader did.
Ralph Nader. He said, let's go get a bunch of billionaires together and solve all these problems. Only the billionaires can save us now, I think was the title of the book or something.
Right, it was a work of fiction, though. It was...
no, he was serious about it.
He was serious?
Yeah.
I haven't read that.
So here's a billionaire in the Trump White House.
Right.
So let me give you a hypothetical on this huge energy combine. Mm-hmm. This could be completely crazy thoughts, but obviously there's been a lot of talk in terms of the relationship with Russia, with Trump, with Putin, with the whole energy business, and it seems. Let me ask you this: there is an area of common interest where Russia and the U.S. can work together, and that is to fight terrorism.
Oh, absolutely.
Nobody really argues that point.
They should, because that's something, Russia's been dealing with it for a very long time, and Russia has pretty advanced intelligence services.
So the U.S. and Russia,
forces,
if they get together, they can probably do a lot to fight terrorism, I think successfully. Mm-hmm. So if the U.S. and Russia get together and they're fighting terrorism and they're looking at the energy patch, isn't the big loser in that alliance Saudi Arabia? It
is, and I have always been skeptical of the United States' long-standing partnership with the Saudis. I don't see that the Saudis
are out there beheading people.
Right.
Saudis, they don't have a policy that maybe is not overly favorable toward the gay community. They frickin' behead gays every day. They're terrorists.
And the last time I checked, the FBI still didn't want to declassify the 9/11 report that talked about links between Saudi royal family members and financing of the 9/11
the
terrorist
hobbyism of the Sunnis in the Saudi kingdom are seemingly the fountainhead of global terrorism.
Absolutely. And so...
as the energy patch, here you have Rex Tillerson, who's number one energy guy in the world, is Secretary of State. He's with Trump and Putin, and they're like, you know what, why don't the three of us just kind of figure out, and we'll just get, Saudis... push them out of the way, and they'll lose their dominance. Their OPEC loses complete ability to price oil. They no longer become the swing vote in the OPEC, and the energy, and they get screwed. Isn't that a positive outcome?
Well, I don't necessarily know that will be the outcome. You have to remember that.
But if that were the outcome, and isn't the table set for something like that? You can't imagine John Kerry doing a deal like that, because John Kerry is a career diplomat. He doesn't know jack.
Maybe if it was just Trump calling the shot, but again, like I said, a lot of these key decisions are going to be carried out by Trump surrogates. Look who the biggest backers are of Rex Tillerson for Secretary of State. It's Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, right? They both know Tillerson. They've worked with him. And Tillerson is all about how can the United States maximize economic opportunities around the world.
And as you point out, I think correctly, the legacy industry in hydrocarbon is heading toward extinction. Mm-hmm. why is there a possibility that somebody from the left, let's say Michael Moore, shows up in the White House along with a whole troop, Nancy Pelosi and Arianna Huffington, and they arrive in the West Wing and they go and they throw up perspectives on Trump's desk. It's a big fat perspective. It's called American Solar Renewal Project, and they point out how solar arrays in the desert in America will create 500,000 jobs, totally, they lay it all out as a business proposition. And Trump, why wouldn't he look, he would look at that and he would say, you know what, this makes good business sense. And so my question is this, shouldn't the left spend less time outside with placards, protesting, picking their nose, and spend more time coming up with a counterproposal?
Right, absolutely. There's no question that renewable energy is the winning bet at this point to power not just the U.S. economy, but the global economy. But again, the gatekeepers to Donald Trump, you're not going to be able to just get into the White House with this proposal. You're going to have to go through Rick Perry, who Donald Trump just nominated to serve as Secretary of Energy. Rick Perry was the governor of Texas. He is extremely tight with the oil and gas production industry in Texas. And so that's a problem. And when you look at Rex Tillerson, this is a guy, Exxon has not invested in renewables.
But we live in an age where the gatekeepers are also become extinct. The mainstream media used to be a gatekeeper, and now they're gone. People are tweeting from the wing of a downed plane in the middle of the Hudson 2 hours before CNBC shows up. Right? Well, there's no gatekeepers. If enough people are out there on social media and out there, they're saying, here's our perspectives, here's it all on the internet, here's 20 million people, Trump, look at this, there's no gatekeepers.
Well,
so again, it seems like you're pre-cooking the excuse. I mean...
No, it's just that the oil industry has considerably more financial and political resources than the corporate media industry did. And so while we've seen decentralization and disintegration of mainstream corporate media in the United States, you're not seeing big oil go down without a pretty serious fight. And all across the country, in state legislatures and in other venues, the incumbent energy industry is fighting for its life, and it's typically winning, right? Even though they're on the losing bet of an issue, it's because they've got such massive political and economic capital invested into our political process. And we've got a political process that is privately financed, and because of the 2010 Citizens United decision, corporations are able to, behind the scenes, really heavily influence the operations of our government and our elections. And
but they're still tying their wagon to an industry that is dying.
Absolutely.
So their power is going to shrink like the Wicked Witch of the West.
It is, but the question is that transition going to happen because the market is going to allow it, or are the fossil fuel industry going to continue to run interference?
Historically, when you have this type of entrenched oligopoly clinging to power, they go to war.
Well, I hope that isn't what it comes to.
Isn't that an outcome a lot of times? I mean, we saw it in World War I, World War II. You saw the players decided that they didn't want to give up their empires, so they went to war. We have a global empire of oil industry companies and kingdoms who, and certainly in the case of Saudi Arabia, is willing to blow up 2 towers in New York to hold on to power. The Congress is complicit by not showing 28 pages of redacted information. So there's obviously tyrants in the White House and in Congress and in Washington, D.C. who are complicit in that act.
No, you're absolutely right.
I mean, and that's a prelude to war. That's a warlike act of war.
Right. And it's why commodity diplomacy is no longer relevant in the 21st century.
War is expensive.
It's extremely expensive.
And Trump is a cheap dude. He's cheap. I'm staying at his frickin' hotel here in D.C. and it looks nice, but he's cutting corners. Let me tell you, some of the marble in the bathroom is not exactly up to standards I would thought it would be. He's a bit of a cheapskate, that guy.
He's the king of it.
War is cheap. It's expensive, and he's talking to like Scrooge. Scrooge, he doesn't want to go to war.
Right.
It's too expensive.
The only concern I see with the ascent of renewables is if this corporate Supreme Court changes the law to allow a company like Exxon to control patent rights over sunshine or the wind blowing.
Right. Well, it gets into a whole other story. I've said for many years that the trademark and patents are really the key activist issue that tie all activist issues because it's essentially the trying to attempt to control your thoughts, essentially. And that's the worst. But anyway, this has been fantastic. I hope you come back on again soon.
Anytime.
Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, that's it for this edition of the Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank Tyson Slocum. He's the Director of Public Citizens Energy Program right here in Washington, D.C. You want to find us on Twitter? Keiser Report. Or just send up a big signal in the sky. I'll come to your house and do the show at your living room table. Until next time, bye, y'all.